Welcome everyone. This is Involving Youth 15 to 17 in Belegarth with Master Squire Antoinette. This class runs until 4 p.m. This class is being recorded and will be available on YouTube at a later date. I'm sure Master Squire Antoinette will be happy to chat with you about this class in the BFTR Discord in the Arts and Sciences channel after the class ends.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. Now, one needs to open one's PowerPoint before one can screen share said PowerPoint. So hi, I'm Squire Antoinette. I am a Master Central. I have been doing this thing called Belegarth for 14 years this year. I'm apologize in advance if my tiny kitten or my cat decides to interrupt our class. There's not a lot I can do about that. I am waiting for my computer to do a thing. Because, of course, computers don't like to do a thing. Here we go. No, I don't want the Chaos Wars class one. I want this one. Come on, computer. The love of Pete. Okay. So, I'm currently the public relations coordinator for Belegarth, and in my everyday life, I'm a special education teacher at the elementary school level, as well as a English teacher at the high school level. I have been the realm leader of Thunderguard. I was the realm leader of Thunderguard for about 5.5 years, where we ran a youth program for youth ages 8 to 15. I have worked with parents and youth, getting them involved in Belegarth for a number of years. So I get a lot of questions about why bother involving people under the fighting age, so the under 16 in Belegarth. And my answer is always that it builds the community and it builds well-rounded, safe, learned fighters when they're old enough to take the field as an adult. Lots of times you get 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds who pop onto the field. They don't necessarily know what they're doing. And they can kind of be a little bit unsafe. And the community can kind of be a little bit unsafe for them if thought hasn't been put into how you involve youth in Belegarth. And so this talk will go over the benefits to the realm, your local physical community, your town, city, neighborhood, the Belegarth community, and of course the youth themselves. We're going to cover talking to parents, what rule changes might need to be made or modified for youth, and why you make those modifications, from just some stuff that I learned running the youth part of Thunderguard. Safety concerns when involving youth outside of fighting, eventing with youth, if that's a thing you feel comfortable doing, modifying your waivers, and then finally the benefits. There'll be some time for questions at the end. But if you do have a question during my talking or I'm talking too fast for you, let me know. So one of the most important things about involving youth in Belegarth outside of the actual youth themselves are their parents or guardians. Especially in today's world, one of the most major issues is parents are going to have questions. Parents are going to have safety concerns. Parents want to know that the people interacting with their kids are safe people. So when you're talking to parents, you want to make sure that you're addressing their concerns effectively. From experience, I find that it's best to have some sort of handout for parents to take home. That handout has information on the realm, your costs, what fighting is, where to obtain things like garb and weapons, contact information for the realm leader, or if you have a youth coordinator, contact information for them, as well as general like information on Belegarth and what happens at a practice. And it's really important to make sure that you have someone who's in charge of handling youth matters. So whether that's one of your realm leaders designated as the person who deals with the parents, or like you have a youth coordinator in your realm, because consistency is really important to build trust between the realm and parents. So making sure that the same person's there to answer the parents' questions, and that the information is always presented in sort of the same manner, is really effective. Making sure that if you have youth and their parents on your realm Facebook, that your realm Facebook isn't full of a bunch of not safe for work stuff, and that you remember that if you have youth involved, their parents are going to see what you're showing them. And you want to make sure that the parents are as comfortable about being involved as the youth are excited about being involved. Because if the parents aren't comfortable, then the kids aren't going to come back because they're kids, essentially. And it is up to their parents what they do and do not take part in. I find it best if you have a parent who's really involved already, asking them if they want to be in charge of talking to other parents. So at one point in time, Kodite's mom, Catherine, was the person who talked to other parents because she was super happy for Kodite to be involved in Belegarth and in a community, and the benefits of that for him was something she talked to parents about a lot. So there are questions that parents will have. Those questions are generally along these lines. How do I get into contact with the group when my children is here? Children are here. Wow. Do you have police records checks for your participants? The answer to that question should always be yes. What are the typical injuries from Belegarth? What are the costs associated with Belegarth? Where can I buy XY needed item for Belegarth? What safety equipment should my children wear? How do we know when and where practices are? Who's the main point of contact? Do my children have to go to events? That's a big one. And I think probably more from our perspective, because going to events involved crossing an international border. Sorry. So parents are going to have questions. These are the most typical questions. We're going to cover some of these in further slides, but having the answers to these questions or other frequently asked parental questions is a really good idea, so that like you have the answer and you're not hemming and hawing, or it's on that handout that I talked about. So there are some fighting safety concerns when you're talking about youth who are like 15 to 17, 14 to 17, which is they're still growing, physically, mentally, emotionally, still growing. which means some of the fighting interactions like shield bashing or shield kicking and grappling, which we know can cause injury, could actually cause injuries that affect the growth of the youth. So in my experience, it's best not to have youth under 16 fight with those who are over 16. That way you can control the physical size, like the number of youth fighters on the field, but also like the size of the people they're fighting. So like you wouldn't want to put a 14, 15-year-old on the same field as like a bunch of massive juggernauts. Just because of the size difference. It's not like, even though our adults are really good at making sure that they're not injuring people and we're all safe people, it's just a matter of like sometimes stuff can happen and you want to negate that stuff that could happen as effectively as possible when you're involving youth. So it is in your best interest for the youth field to always have a herald or a marshal for safety reasons, whether it's 3 youth or 15 youth or 50 youth. You want to make sure that that field has a marshal, and you generally want to make sure that there's at least one marshal to every like 10 youth, give or take. For obvious safety concerns, right? So in Thunderguard, when we had our youth field, we don't have a lot of youth right now. We didn't before the pandemic. Our youth field disallowed shield bashing and kicking and grappling. And we at one point allowed the kids to use spears and reds, but that changed and we disallowed children under the age of 16, so our 14, 15-year-olds, to use spears or reds just for safety issues, because some of those weapons can be really big and kids can be small, and like their coordination isn't always grand. Our youth were, again, after some issues, hindsight, right? Were required to wear knee pads and some type of gloves. Again, just because kids are still growing and those knee injuries and hand injuries that are typical in Belegarth can cause like growth plate issues in kids. So like our kids were required to wear knee pads and required to wear some type of gloves. At one point, all of our boys were required to wear cups, but that became a personal preference thing after a while. But you just want to make sure that when you have youth on the field, whether they're 16 and 17-year-olds fighting with the adults or they're 14, 15-year-olds fighting together, that they're being safe because they're still growing. And one of the other major things for safety concerns for fighting is that it's insanely important to review the rules with youth on a regular basis. I mean, it's important to review the rules with normal people on a regular basis. But making sure the youth have a concept of how the rules work is really important because it helps keep them safe. And we found that eventually they'll be able to explain the rules to you. And once they can do that, they're generally fairly competent. And we also had a bridging thing where if you were 16 and you were moving from like the kids field to the adult field, because we had 2 separate fighting fields, that you had to go through like a kind of like a rules test and like a fighting safety thing. So we would ask them questions about the Book of War, questions about realm-specific rules, because we have a few of those, and then like general kind of safety questions, and then they would have to fight a set number of adults effectively and make sure that like they were doing so safely and they could handle things. And when they went from 14, 15 and fighting just with the youth to 16, 17 and fighting with the adults, they had to go through a spear and red safety class before they could use those weapon styles, just because, again, kids are still growing, they can be gangly and awkward, and those weapon styles are a little bit more dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. So those are some of the fighting safety concerns that we found, especially the grappling, bashing, and kicking. Until they're honestly 18-ish, when they've sort of stopped growing. At least physically, most people have stopped growing vertically, at least by then. It's kind of just a safety thing, because the growth plates in kids, if they get messed up really early, they might not be able to be fixed, and then that can affect like their overall growth and health in later life, which is really dangerous. There are some non-fighting safety concerns when having youth. Depending on how long you've been in Belegarth, you probably have some idea that there have been some very serious issues within our community when involving youth in Belegarth. These issues have a very valid place to be concerns for realm leaders and parents alike. So when you're involving youth in your realm, in Belegarth, in events, it is of the utmost importance to keep them safe physically, mentally, and emotionally, which means making sure the people they're interacting with are safe. So for Thunderguard, that meant everyone had an up-to-date police records check with vulnerable sector. That's what Ontario calls the sex offender search part of the police records check on file for any of your realm leaders and for anyone else in the realm who will be interacting with the youth. If the youth are completely separate from the adults and they don't even have practice on the same day, or they only interact with 3 people, then great. It's impossible to know everyone who shows up at your practice who just wanders over and wants to start fighting. But if you have consistent members who are there all of the time, those members should have a police records check, because then you can prove to parents that you know everyone who's interacting with their kids on a regular basis is a safe person. And other things that are really important as non-fighting safety concerns: when you have youth, you want to make sure you know who's allowed to pick them up from practice and who's not, and have that listed somewhere, and that the parents know if they're sending someone who's not on the list, they need to tell you, or if that kid's allowed to go home with their friends' parents that day, the parents need to let you know that. I suggest strongly that parents not just drop their kids off at practice and leave, but that is going to happen, so you want to be prepared for that. You also want to make sure you know which youth are allowed to walk to and from practice, and make sure you have a way to check in with parents when the youth arrives at practice, so the parents know they got from point A to point B safely, and a way for parents to check in with you when the youth gets home, so you know that they've gotten from practice to home safely. Schools tend to call that a safe arrival program. It's sort of similar. And you also want to make sure that if youth are getting picked up from practice, you or whoever is in charge of the youth on the field do not leave practice until all of the youth have been picked up. Because the minute you leave a youth alone somewhere, problems can happen. And because you were acting in loco parentis if their parents weren't present, it could get blamed on you. So you want to make sure that all of the youth get picked up before you leave practice. You also want to make sure that you have proper emergency medical information for your youth. So oftentimes waivers, adults don't really put all of the information they probably should. They write down 911 and move on. But for kids, it's really important that you know any prevalent medical issues, diabetes, injuries, allergies, as well as contact information for their parents, and health card is a Canadian thing, or insurance card, or some sort of identification, so that if you need to take this youth to the hospital, you have the information the hospital is going to ask you when you get there. So those are some of the non-fighting safety concerns. This is the part about having youth that scares a lot of people, because there's so many things that could possibly go wrong, and that have gone wrong within the community at large in the past, that we just want to make sure that, yes, while youth are a great recruitment tool and growth part of Belegarth, there's also stuff that goes along with keeping them safe, not just on the fighting field, that you need to make sure that you understand. The waivers are a part of that. So youth waivers are a little bit different than adult waivers. Youth waivers must be signed by the youth's parent or legal guardian, as well as the youth themselves. And if they do not have a waiver, they are not fighting. So if you have a kid who shows up and they want to fight, but their parents aren't with them to sign the waiver, then send the waiver home and tell them once they have it signed, they can come back. It is a legal thing. It's a safety thing. It's a covering your butt thing. No waiver, no fighting if you are under 18. Period. At all. And your youth waiver needs to or must contain some information that adult waivers usually don't. And those are things like a photo release or social media release. Because they are a minor, you have to make sure you have their parents' permission to put their image on stuff. That means putting pictures on Facebook. That means putting pictures on Instagram. That means tweets. That means websites. So having that photo release or social media release is really important. And if a parent says, no, I don't want my kid's picture on places, you have to make sure you abide by that. Again, medical information, medical conditions, allergies, health card or insurance card information, or other identifying information, to make sure that if you have to take that kid to the hospital, you have the information the hospital's going to need to provide them with care. Safe arrival and departure information, as well as at least 2 emergency contacts beyond the parent or legal guardian. So that means having 2 additional people you can contact if something goes horribly wrong. For extra safety, some realms will require the waiver to be certified by a lawyer or notary public. We didn't do that, but oftentimes for events that happens, and I know that it's generally just a good next step to make sure like the parents have signed this, they understand what it means, and there's somebody who's like witnessed that. So if you have youth or you're looking at recruiting youth, you need to take a look at your realms waiver and change it or add to it to make sure that it covers areas that would be needed to be covered for youth specifically. And having 2 separate waivers, one for youth, one for adults, is generally the norm. So for Thunderguard, we had a youth waiver that required the parents or legal guardians and the youth to sign. So it had 2 initial slots, one for the parent and legal guardian, and one for the youth. It had 2 signature spots. And just making sure, like, yes, the parents know what's happening, but the youth also themselves understand what they're signing. Sorry, kitten. So, you don't have to take youth who are not blood related to you to events if that makes you uncomfortable. However, making sure you know what goes into that, if you decide you want to do that, is a good thing. I did that with Kodite and Kaivon when Kodite was 16 and 17, and with Kaivon from 15 to 17. It's a lot of work. And it's not everyone's jam, and that's okay. So when you event with youth who are not your family, there are things you need to consider. The waiver is one. Most events are going to ask you to have your waiver when bringing a youth who you are not blood related to be signed by the parent or legal guardian, the youth themselves, and the chaperone, so you, in front of a lawyer or notary public, and have the waiver notarized. If you are bringing a youth who is family, your child, your younger brother, that's different most of the time. Rules. There are rules you need to consider when eventing with youth, such as, are they allowed to wander around alone? What camps are they allowed to visit alone? What happens if they're caught drinking underage or in places that they shouldn't be? Those are just sort of general. You would have to talk to some of the boys that I brought to events to see kind of how that worked. But they are minors. They are your responsibility if you bring them to an event, and making sure you know where they are, when they are, how they are, is a really good idea. A letter of in loco parentis. No matter what, if you are traveling with a youth you are not related to, you should have a letter from the youth's parent or legal guardian that gives you permission to act in loco parentis in case of emergency. If you're not sure what the term in loco parentis means, that means you are acting instead of the parent and you have permission from the parent to do so. Teachers act in loco parentis every day. It's part of how school works. When you are taking someone who you are not related to and you are assuming responsibility for them for a time period, you are acting in loco parentis, which means in case of an emergency, God forbid, something happens on the way to the event, on the way home from the event, at the event, you have permission to act on that child's behalf at that time. If you get pulled over, if something happens and police show up at the event and they want to make sure that this child hasn't been kidnapped, having that letter is super important. Travel plans. This might be more important to me given that I had to cross an international border with kids, but making sure the parents know your travel plans, your schedule, your general idea of where you'll be stopping along the way, if it's a long distance drive, is really important. Having the ability to make sure parents have your cell phone number or they can contact you is super important because parents just want to know where their kids are. So if you have a travel plan and you know it's going to take us 8 hours to get from point A to point B and we're going to stop at 3 hours and 6 hours in these sort of general areas, it's a pretty good idea to give the parents that information. And I'm going to skip identification and go to pre-event meeting and come back to that. And it's best to give that parents that information at a pre-event meeting. So if you are taking a child or more than one child, it's best to have a meeting with the parents pre the event so that all of the parents and the youth are on the same page and they get all the information at the same time. And the parents know all of the rules the kids need to follow. The kids know all of the rules they need to follow. They get a packing list, how much money they might need, when they're traveling, where we're traveling to, how long that travel's going to take, when we're leaving the event to come back, all of those sorts of things. Regardless of whether or not you are crossing an international border, making sure the parents are cool with what's happening and they know what the expectations are, as do the youth, is a really good idea. We're going to skip up to identification. We all know we need ID to get into events, but when you are traveling with a youth, especially a youth to whom you are not related to, it's incredibly important to have some form of identification for the youth, in case, of course, something horrible goes awry. They're going to need the event or ID to get in the event anyways, so things like birth certificates, an underage ID card if you have that, Canadians have health cards or your school ID, passport, something that has your birth date and a photo. If you kids don't have that, I would suggest carrying a copy of their birth certificate, not their actual birth certificate, and their school ID, so you can use them both, because the school ID generally won't be accepted as a form of ID at events. Birth certificate will, but it's best to have a copy of that picture ID anyways. Making sure you have identification for the youth is really important. Again, in case you get pulled over and you have to talk to the police or something happens and you have to go to the hospital. Those are the most important things about eventing with youth. I mean, making sure everyone knows what the expectations are and they're clear is super important. My boys always knew if they screwed up, they would be spending the rest of the day with me. Which meant they wouldn't get to fight, because we all know I don't fight, and they would be spending most of the day in troll, which is not fun for them. And so I was fairly strict with the rules I had for them going to events, and I mean, nothing horrible ever happened. So I would suggest, if you're taking kids to events who are not your kids or not related to you in any way, that you're pretty strict with the rules, that they generally can wander around by themselves during the day, but at night they shouldn't. And as much as I love groups of people, there are probably camps, especially at night, that they shouldn't be in alone. Just because then you're not worried about what could possibly accidentally happen. Yeah. Capturing youth's attention. So, there are lots of things that you can do to, like, recruit, but when you are thinking about specifically recruiting youth, we're at our core a medieval high fantasy based society. We pull from Tolkien, we pull from medieval history, we pull from basically anything pre-European gunpowder, that sort of falls into that medieval fantasy genre of stuff. However, I'm not personally a fan of meshing clearly non-medieval high fantasy stuff within Belegarth. I realize that in order for us to recruit specifically youth, we need to be a touch more open to meshing current pop culture like anime and fantasy, comics, all that sort of stuff into Belegarth, because it makes us more interesting. So bridging pop culture and Bell is a way to sort of like get people interested. Cosplay is currently one of those things that's sort of at the forefront of pop culture. It used to be just a thing that nerds did, and now it's really cool. So if we can, and we definitely can, combine aspects of like cosplay into Belegarth, we can get those youth that are really interested in cosplay and sort of bridge them in with that. Especially all the skills that go along with that, and like making sure that when you're recruiting youth, you look at all of the things that can benefit them. And one of those things is like the creative sewing, crafting aspect of Belegarth, right? That's going to be interesting to a lot of kids. We all know that right now the fighting age at most events is 16, some events it's 18. But it may be something to start looking into, providing the space for at events and practices for youth aged 14 to 16, and providing them with youth tournaments. It's something the SCA does really well, that we might want to consider starting when we get out of this horrid plague of Nurgle. Recruiting youth is going to be a really nice way of rebolstering our sort of depleted recruitment numbers, and providing them with space at events and specific youth tournaments is a really good way of like bridging that. Yes, the field fighting age is 16, but we really want to involve you at a younger age sort of thing. So those are some ideas. Batter it around with your realm. Figure out what's going on around you. Figure out what the kids at the local high schools are interested in. Talk to your local schools. It's something I was going to cover, but it's kind of its own discussion because each school and school board is really different. But we are a federal nonprofit organization in the US. So looking at talking to schools in that manner where we're presenting it as educational, because that's sort of how our nonprofit falls. Targeting specifically the history, targeting the home ec, targeting the woodworking, targeting the bardic side of things, targeting the phys ed side of things. When you're presenting that information to the school is really important. Benefits for the realm. So clearly I wouldn't be talking about this if there wasn't benefits for the realm, for the community at all. So growth is definitely a benefit. Involving youth is a great way to grow your realm. Kids who get into Belegarth tell their friends, and then they bring them with them. Well-rounded realm members. When you have youth members, they tend to turn into adult members. I would say a good 7 or 8 of our consistent youth members in Thunderguard are now adult members. In fact, they're running Thunderguard now. And so they've got more time to learn how the realm and the community works, and they've got more time to learn the skills they need to build the realm. They're great helpers. I don't know about how high school works in the States a lot of times, but in Ontario, high school students, in order to graduate, have a mandatory 40 hours of volunteer service they can do. Most of my boys got that done in a day at an event, or over the course of a weekend at an event. And they have a ton of energy. Honestly, if I could siphon the energy that Kodite and Kaivon and Ziston had as children, and just even a smidgen of it, I'd never be tired again. And they have a ton of energy, and they want things they can put on their job and college applications. And the ability to say that they've helped out running things like large-scale events, recruitment drives, for a nonprofit is a great thing to be able to put on said college or job applications. And in the US, because we're a federal nonprofit, there are grants that the realms can likely access for youth endeavors, which could mean supplying the youth part of your realm with weapons. It could mean having garb money to make them their first set of garb, kind of things. I don't totally know how that works, but it's a possibility out there. So in many places, there's a growing need for youth activities. I know, especially personally, when many of us 30-somethings were 14 to 17, there was way more stuff for us to do in our local communities. From things like all ages nights at dance clubs, to youth dances at churches and community centers, LAN parties, library activities, and other activities. And those things just don't happen anymore. Youth today, in a lot of places, but especially in smaller towns and cities, don't have these options. They don't have a safe place to go on the weekend and just hang out. Spend a lot of time at home. Creating a safe place for youth to go and take part in both a physical and creative activity is a thing that most communities are looking for. So being that space for youth to come is a great asset to your local community. And so there may be local initiatives that you can take part in, local youth weeks or youth like activity groups that you can get in touch with, and be part of that part of your local community and give those youth that ability to do those activities, which bolsters the image of the realm as being a group of people who are there for the local community and not just a bunch of nerds swinging at each other with foam swords in the park, which helps build your recruitment in your local community. Benefits for the greater Belegarth community. Most of the benefits for the greater Belegarth community are pretty much the same as the benefits for involving youth in the realm. Involving youth in Belegarth is something that allows the greater community to grow in a fairly sustainable way. Youth who do stick with Belegarth but move away to college take the sport with them and build new realms. Since they've been taking part in Belegarth since they were youth, they're pretty well-rounded and knowledgeable on how to run a realm effectively by the time they get to that point. Lots of realms are started because somebody moved to somewhere where there wasn't a realm. I'm fairly certain that after this pandemic is over, we'll have a realm in British Columbia, because one of my guys finished college and moved out there for a job. And when he moved to the place he went to college, he built a realm there. So now we'll have 2 realms from the same dude who started Belegarth when he was 14. And again, involving youth in the community opens up a wealth of grants in the US for federal nonprofits that we weren't able to look at before. So all of those things are super beneficial to the greater community, but like a sustained way of recruiting and building our player base is probably the best one that I can think of. There are so many benefits of participating in Belegarth for youth. Socialization is probably the most major one, followed by exercise. Belegarth gives youth a chance to socialize outside of school, probably with youth from other parts of the city or schools, kids they would have never met, and it gives them a wider range of friends and the ability to learn social skills, which is the thing lots of kids don't have a lot of options to do these days, especially lots of low-cost options. Exercise. We all know that its core, Belegarth is a very physical activity. Many youth don't get to take part in extracurricular sports due to overwhelming costs. Belegarth gives them Belegarth is a low-cost option, especially if they just borrow realm loaner equipment that gives them a physical outlet. Low cost. When compared to other extracurricular sports such as figure skating, hockey, football, soccer, etc., Belegarth costs much less, which is something that parents enjoy. And it's also something that lower income families can enjoy without worrying about their kids not being able to participate in extracurriculars. Creativity. Belegarth gives youth a creative outlet. Youth who might not be into the fighting, but into the creativity, can learn leatherworking, sewing, painting, other ANS skills. Belegarth has many creative outlets built into it that we don't really think about, because they've just always been there. Team building. Belegarth gives youth a chance to work on their teamwork skills in a real-world setting. Being able to work well with others is a super important skill that will benefit them in life, at their job, in university. Oh, sorry, I have a tiny bean trying to move. So,
10 minutes.
This is a comment. Oh,
10 minutes.
Okay. This is a comment from Squire Antoinette, now Squire Antoinette, from House Hellhammer. As a kid, Belegarth took on the same role that other mainstream extracurriculars did. Everyone becomes passionate about something at that age, even if it doesn't stick. I had a friend with a similar obsession with RC cars and several into hockey. It provided a community to feel a part of and an activity to dream about when things got dull. It was that thing that you always seemed to want to do, even though you know you had better things to think about. Belegarth for me brought out a creative passion I knew I had but needed an outlet for. Belegarth is unique because of how multidisciplinary it is. If you want to just fight, you can just fight. If you're really into socializing and fantasy culture, then you will be surrounded with like-minded people. You want to become a master craftsman? Belegarth can definitely facilitate that. Want everything? Yep, it's all yours. I feel like because of Belegarth, my experience as a youth had just a bit more depth and interesting than those of my friends who became interested in other activities, and it stayed with me into adulthood because of its breadth of content to explore. Questions? Does anyone
Hello.
have any? No?
I do have questions.
Go ahead, Tarps.
So they're related. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for all that information. It definitely opened my eyes up for some more like from like a legal perspective.
Okay.
So before we had to enter quarantine, we had like a number of people join our realm that have children, including myself. I have a child, a 7-year-old, so it's not quite the what you're talking about. But I noticed that we started recruiting people, and each one of them had a little one. And I was starting to do activities that kind of catered a little bit more to not involving them, but providing a space where the parents felt that it was comfortable to bring them while they attended practice. But yeah, we didn't adjust the waivers or anything. I didn't think of that. All I did was really try to create a space at the practice that they couldn't be hit, or they weren't going to be in, I guess, the way of anybody who's fighting. So definitely, I appreciate that. I'm going to take a look at our waiver and make sure that I think I might have taken some pictures, for example, and posted them onto Facebook, and they might have been in the background or something. So I definitely going to double check on that stuff moving forward. I guess my question is, given all the information you just gave us on like activities in which they can involve 15 to 17-year-olds, is there any way that we can involve young children, not in fighting, but in maybe non-fighter relating activities? And if 15, 17 also could be included in this, but is there anything to cater to children that wouldn't be able to take the field?
So it's really hard for kids who are younger. Belegarth or Thunderguard did allow kids to start fighting at age 8, which in hindsight was a horribly bad idea. And about 7 years ago, we went to 13 because of the university we practiced at wouldn't let anyone younger than that participate. And we've just sort of left it there because in hindsight, having 8-year-olds fighting was not a great idea and was super dangerous. But we've been involved in a number of like local outreach programs. So like the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Friendship Center brought us in to do like crafting with the kids, to do like leather working and chainmail. We've done a number of things with the local Boy Scout groups. We've done a number of like school things. And like schools would reach out to us and be like, especially like because in Ontario in grade 4 they do a medieval unit, so like clothing and food and stuff like that. So there are ways to involve kids who are younger, but it honestly depends on the realm and the kids. So like the reason we had kids who were that young fighting is because we had realm members with kids that age, kind of like what you said.
Yeah.
So it really depends on like if the kids are going to be there all of the time, then finding something to occupy their time with so they're not bored is a really great idea. But it can be really hard unless you have someone dedicated to that. So Chaos Wars has a child family sober activities coordinator, usually Sarka. And she's created activities, and as Chaos Wars wanted to be a family friendly setting, we made sure we had space for those sorts of things. So like it's really a discussion you want to have with your realm and figure out which way we want to go. It's a really tricky question, and it all depends on the resources you have available to you, honestly.
5 minutes.
Those are great points. Thank you. I kind of wanted to touch briefly on something you said about, I don't know who Kodite is, but you mentioned Kodite's parent as kind of like a point of contact to speak to other parents about.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, involved with your realm, was that kind of like an unofficial position or just something that like you had a conversation with them about? Or was it something like, this is our parent coordinator?
It sort of just happened because Catherine, Kodite's mom, would come to practices with him until he was about 15, and then he came to practices on his own. And so she sort of just ended up talking to other parents who were interested because she was really happy that her son had something to do. Thunder Bay doesn't have a lot like outside of hockey to do for kids who are younger. Like there's nothing. Like the library doesn't even have programs anymore for youth. Just because of I guess budgeting at the city level. So she was really happy that her son found something he enjoyed doing. And she was really like happy to talk to parents whose kids might be interested. So that sort of just happened. But after that, we made sure that we had someone at every practice to talk to parents because it was really important. So having a youth coordinator, whether it's a parent of a youth who comes to practice every week, or it's a realm member, or it's a elected realm position, it's really important to build that trust between the realm and the parents of the youth who are coming in, because they want to know who their kids are interacting with. So this is my contact information for you guys. My Facebook, my email, and my Discord. If you have any questions about it, if you decide when this pandemic's over, you guys want to build a youth program and you have further questions you want answered, go ahead and give me a shout.
All right, we
Wonderful,
need
thank
to wrap
you.
it up right there. Thank you, Master Antoinette, for your great class. If you have any more questions on this topic, please go over to the BFTR Discord and continue in the Arts and Sciences channel. Coming up next, we have Fighting with Anxiety with Journeywoman Saber, and that will start at 4:05. Thank you, Masters. Squire Master Antoinette.